Audrey Griffin was the kind of woman everyone admired, calm, thoughtful, and quietly brilliant. Callum Brecht was the man no one noticed, reclusive, unsettling, and forgotten by the town. But when Audrey's lifeless body was discovered beneath a veil of lace, it was Callum's disturbing past that unraveled a trail of death, obsession, and secrets buried far deeper than anyone imagined. Audrey Griffin was a quiet force in the town of Greybridge. At 28 years old, she lived alone in a small cedarwood cottage nestled near the edge of the forest. She was a freelance writer who preferred birdsong to city noise and lived a life that many envied for its simplicity. Her days were mostly filled with long walks in the woods, journaling in sunlit corners, and taking photos of wildflowers. On September 11th, Audrey posted a picture of a sun-drenched path on her social media, captioned with a single leaf emoji. It was the last time anyone heard from her. Eloise Merrick, her closest friend since university, became worried when Audrey didn't respond to her text that evening. They had planned to meet for dinner at a local cafe, something they rarely missed. When she called and got no answer, Eloise drove out to Audrey's cottage. The door was locked, but her car was parked out front. A breeze moved the curtains inside. There was no movement, no reply to knocks. Something felt wrong. The next morning, Eloise called the police and filed a missing person report. Officers arrived and entered the cottage. Inside, everything seemed untouched. The table was set for one, with a cup of tea still warm. Audrey's notebook sat open, her handwriting trailing off mid-sentence. Her phone was plugged into the charger on the kitchen counter, untouched. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no scattered furniture. It was as if she had stood up from her writing and vanished into thin air. Search parties were organized, helicopters scanned the surrounding forest, and volunteers combed every trail Audrey was known to walk. Days passed with no sign of her. The community grew restless, fear settling in the air like morning fog. What began as concern turned into dread. Theories circulated, maybe she ran off, maybe she got lost, but those who knew her rejected the idea. Audrey was careful, experienced in the woods, and she never wandered too far without telling someone. 7 days after she was reported missing, a boy walking his dog near a shallow creek found her body. She was partially submerged under broken branches, as though someone had tried to hide her but lacked the strength or time to bury her completely. Her arms were folded neatly over her chest. Her shoes were missing. Most unsettling of all was the lace veil over her face, pinned delicately into her hair as if it were a bridal piece. The scene was disturbing in its precision. The autopsy report showed no external injuries, no signs of sexual assault, and no presence of drugs or alcohol in her system. The cause of death was suffocation. She had died from pressure applied to the nose and mouth, with no bruising indicating violence. Whoever killed her had done so carefully, perhaps methodically. The use of the veil and the pose suggested something far more chilling than a random act of violence. This wasn't an accident or a crime of passion. It was staged. Detective Rowan Tace, who had recently transferred from the city to Greybridge, was assigned the case. He had seen crime scenes staged before, but never quite like this. The veil in particular struck him as symbolic. He believed the killer wanted the body to be found, wanted someone to see their work. The killer had chosen a place where hikers and kids often wandered. It wasn't hidden well, it was displayed. The investigation began with interviews of everyone in Audrey's life, friends, colleagues, even distant acquaintances. No one had seen or heard anything unusual, but then a tip came in from a park ranger. On the day Audrey vanished, a camera placed on a tree for wildlife monitoring had captured a hooded figure walking along a trail that intersected with the one Audrey often used. The figure passed once in the morning and again just before sunset. They were alone both times. Their face was obscured, but their posture, stride, and build were noted. Audrey Griffin's quiet life had ended in a chilling, deliberate act. The town that once seemed peaceful now carried an air of suspicion and fear. Someone in Greybridge had secrets, and her death was only the beginning. Detective Rowan Tace narrowed his focus to the shadowy figure seen twice on the trail camera. The footage offered no clear facial features, but certain physical traits were evident. The person was tall, lean, and had an unusual gait, slightly dragging the right leg. This small detail would become more significant than anyone realized. Rowan knew this wasn't the work of someone passing through town. It had the markings of a killer who was comfortable in these woods, someone who knew when and where to move without drawing attention. The town of Greybridge had a population of just over 3,000, and few residents matched the physical description caught on camera. One name kept surfacing in whispers: Callum Brecht. He was known as a recluse, living in an aging farmhouse deep in the woods on the town's northern edge. Locals remembered him as odd but harmless. He rarely spoke, avoided crowds, and was only ever seen at dusk walking the wooded paths. Rumors circulated about his childhood, about how he had once been institutionalized, but no one had details. Detective Tace made the decision to pay Callum a visit. The house was a decaying structure, nearly swallowed by ivy and surrounded by tall, unkempt grass. No vehicle in sight. When Rowan knocked, no answer came. But from inside, a faint shuffling sound could be heard. Someone was there. With a warrant secured later that day, officers returned and entered the home. What they found was disturbing. The interior was dark, windows blacked out with heavy curtains. The furniture was antique, worn and arranged with strange symmetry. Books on criminal psychology, anatomy, and Victorian customs lined the shelves. In the corner sat a glass display case containing vintage dolls dressed in lace. But the most unnerving discovery was in the back room, a shed converted into a workspace. Inside were surgical tools, several human hair samples carefully labeled in envelopes, and a notebook filled with diagrams of facial muscles, alongside handwritten notes about preserving beauty after death. One envelope was marked with the initials AG. Inside it was a lock of auburn hair, later confirmed to be Audrey's through DNA testing. Beneath the envelope, a pressed violet flower was taped onto the page. Audrey's favorite flower, one she often photographed. Callum was brought in for questioning. He was calm, almost emotionless, answering most questions with quiet indifference. He admitted he had been in the forest that day but claimed he had been birdwatching and never saw Audrey. When asked about the hair sample, he simply said he collected things that wouldn't be missed. The notebook, he explained, was part of a personal research project, but his explanations fell apart under scrutiny. His fingerprints were found on one of the pins used in the veil on Audrey's body. His boot tread matched impressions found near the creek. Yet there was something about Callum that unsettled everyone. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't confused. It was as if he didn't recognize the weight of the situation, or worse, didn't care. Dr. Mariah Lorne, a forensic psychologist, was brought in to assess his mental state. Her early assessment suggested a high-functioning psychotic disorder, possibly rooted in childhood trauma. She requested access to his juvenile records, which were sealed. At the same time, Detective Tace continued to dig into Callum's background. It turned out that Callum had been sent to a state-run psychiatric facility at the age of 14 after an incident involving a caregiver. The files were locked behind court orders, but even the redacted summaries hinted at violence, possibly fatal. Nothing about it had ever been made public, and no charges had followed. Neighbors began coming forward with strange stories. They recalled hearing singing late at night coming from the woods, spotting Callum standing still for hours near the forest edge, and once seeing him burying something near his shed. But no one had ever thought to report it until now. The case against Callum Brecht was growing rapidly, yet Detective Tace had a gnawing feeling that Audrey wasn't his only victim. The veil, the posing, the deliberate nature of it all. It felt like a pattern, a ritual, something that had been done before, something that might be done again. As Detective Rowan Tace continued to unravel the strange world of Callum Brecht, deeper layers of his past began to surface, each more unsettling than the last. Dr. Mariah Lorne, the forensic psychologist assigned to assess Callum, had seen her share of disturbed individuals, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Callum's mind operated in a different, calculated rhythm. She requested access to his sealed juvenile records, and after several legal hurdles, was finally granted partial access. What she uncovered reframed the entire case. At the age of 14, Callum had been institutionalized after a female nurse was found dead inside the facility where he had been staying. The records revealed chilling parallels to Audrey's murder. The nurse, a woman named Mara Dinsley, had been discovered in a small supply room, her body carefully posed, with a veil made from medical gauze covering her face. The case had been written off as a suicide by hospital administration, despite internal disagreements. The report noted that Callum had a deep fixation on death presentation, and often spoke of the moment the soul lets go, referring to it as a form of art. He was transferred shortly afterward to a different facility, and the incident was buried in bureaucratic silence. Maria also uncovered psychological evaluations from that time, which mentioned that Callum's mother had subjected him to strange forms of punishment. According to the files, she forced him to participate in mock funerals, complete with hymns, veils, and eulogies whenever he misbehaved. These rituals, documented by social workers, were dismissed as eccentric parenting rather than abuse. But the scars they left were clear. Detective Tace shifted focus to Callum's family, hoping to find someone who could fill in the blanks. That's when he located Callum's older brother, Silas Brecht, living under a different name in a neighboring state. Silas agreed to speak on the condition of privacy and shared a harrowing account of their childhood. Silas described their mother as obsessed with purity and silence. She believed that quietness brought one closer to spiritual truth, often keeping the boys isolated from the outside world. Callum, the younger of the two, had been her favorite and the most affected. Their mother would dress him in white clothing and force him to sleep in a locked attic for reflection. She spoke often of death not as an end but as a beautiful pause. When Silas turned 16, he escaped the house and never looked back. What disturbed Silas the most was what happened a year later. He received a letter from Callum, written in childish handwriting but filled with cryptic lines. "She's quiet now. I dressed her nicely. The house doesn't cry anymore." Silas suspected then that their mother had died, possibly at Callum's hands, but fear and guilt kept him silent. This information triggered a renewed search of Callum's property. With a warrant and cadaver dogs, authorities focused on the overgrown land behind the greenhouse. The soil, soft in patches despite weeks of dry weather, raised suspicion. After hours of digging, the team unearthed human remains. Forensic examination confirmed they belonged to an adult woman, estimated to have died nearly 15 years prior, consistent with the time Callum's mother had disappeared. But the shock didn't end there. A few feet away, another shallow grave was discovered. The remains were of a second woman, likely in her 20s. Dental records did not match anyone local. Investigators now suspected Callum had killed before Audrey years earlier, and no one had noticed. The chilling realization settled like a cold fog over the investigation. Audrey Griffin had not been a random victim. She had been part of a ritual, a performance Callum had rehearsed in his mind for years. The veil, the precise positioning, the serene presentation, it all pointed to a man reenacting memories, possibly reliving traumas, and perhaps honoring a twisted idea of beauty he had been taught as a child. Callum Brecht was no longer just a suspect. He was a disturbed individual shaped by a sinister past. But the full extent of what he had done and why was still buried beneath layers of secrets and silence. After the discovery of two bodies behind Callum Brecht's greenhouse, one confirmed to be his long-missing mother, and the other an unidentified young woman, Detective Rowan Tace and his team faced the chilling possibility that Audrey Griffin's murder was not a standalone event, but rather the latest in a long, disturbing pattern. The burial sites, eerily symmetrical and marked by items arranged with unsettling care, pointed to a ritualistic mind, one that viewed death not as destruction, but as preservation. Callum remained in custody, silent and withdrawn, speaking only when prompted and offering vague, disconnected responses. He showed no signs of remorse. If anything, his behavior was eerily calm, like a man who believed the world had finally caught up to a truth he'd known all along. Dr. Maria Lorne, still piecing together his psychological profile, noted a clear detachment from emotion and an obsession with post-mortem aesthetics. According to her evaluation, Callum didn't see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as a curator of beauty, a caretaker of frozen moments. Back at his house, investigators continued to uncover disturbing details. In a locked trunk beneath the floorboards of his bedroom, police found a series of sketches, dozens of charcoal drawings, all of women posed in still, peaceful positions, hands clasped, heads tilted gently, eyes closed. Some bore names. Others were simply labeled with dates. Many of the women didn't match any missing persons cases, but a few did. One in particular matched the features of a woman named Clara Denson, who had vanished 4 years earlier after passing through Greybridge during a hiking trip. Callum had never been connected to Clara's disappearance. There had been no evidence tying him to her case, until now. In the sketches, Clara's pose was identical to that of Audrey's. A lace veil covered her drawn face. When authorities reviewed surveillance footage from the time of Clara's disappearance, they discovered a blurry figure in the background of a general store photo, tall, lean, with a noticeable limp. The same pattern, over and over again. It became clear that the killer had developed a blueprint: find women who resembled a certain type, lure them into isolated areas, and stage their deaths with haunting precision. But what no one could understand was the root of his obsession. Why the veils? Why the bridal imagery? What was he trying to replicate? The answers, as always, were buried in Callum's past. Dr. Lorne, reviewing therapy notes from his childhood facility, came across a session transcript. In it, Callum described a dream he had repeatedly as a boy: a woman lying on a bed of flowers dressed in white, her face hidden behind lace. In the dream, she never moved, never spoke. She simply existed in silence, and that silence, Callum said, was beautiful. Lorne realized that the dream wasn't a dream at all. It was a memory that had been twisted into an ideal. He had seen his mother in such a state, possibly after her death, and now he was recreating that image with every victim. Meanwhile, forensic teams worked to identify the second body found near Callum's mother. They eventually matched the dental records to a woman named Elawera Ketz, who had been reported missing from a neighboring town 7 years earlier. Elawera had once worked as a caregiver at the very psychiatric hospital Callum had been admitted to as a teen. The connection was undeniable. This discovery shattered the theory that Callum's crimes were recent. He had been killing for years, possibly as far back as his late teens. The peaceful mask he wore in Greybridge, the solitary walker, the harmless recluse, had covered a history soaked in manipulation and murder. Detective Tace ordered a full excavation of the surrounding property, unsure how many victims still lay undiscovered beneath the soil. The scale of Callum's crimes was larger than anyone had imagined. Audrey Griffin's death had simply pulled the first thread. What unraveled next revealed a tapestry of horror woven across years of silence. And it wasn't over yet. There were signs that Callum had been preparing a new display, a fresh arrangement. Inside the hidden parlor room beneath the house, among the porcelain dolls and dim lights, was an empty chair draped in lace, waiting. Beneath Callum Brecht's decaying farmhouse, behind a concealed door and under layers of dust and mildew, investigators uncovered what would later be described as a museum of mourning. It was a room preserved in unnatural stillness, like a stage awaiting its final performance. The walls were lined with peeling floral wallpaper. Antique portraits hung crooked on nails. In the center sat a wooden chair, draped in ivory lace, positioned in front of a vanity mirror lit by dim, flickering bulbs. A single red rose lay atop the seat. No fingerprints, no dust, no signs of age. This room had been visited often, maintained meticulously. What disturbed investigators most was not the room itself, but the objects surrounding it. Several boxes stacked along the walls contained women's belongings, scarves, lockets, handwritten notes, and even perfume bottles, items later confirmed to belong to multiple missing women from nearby towns. Each item was tagged with initials and a date, some going back nearly a decade. Among them were Audrey Griffin's earrings, carefully wrapped in a silk cloth marked AG. A hidden drawer beneath the vanity revealed a collection of video memory cards. Each one was labeled with a series of numbers, presumed to be dates. Detectives, with grim caution, began reviewing the footage. What they saw removed any lingering doubt about the extent of Callum Brecht's crimes. The videos weren't of the murders themselves. They were of the aftermath. Silent footage of lifeless bodies, posed veiled, surrounded by soft lighting. Each scene appeared staged, rehearsed like portraits of death. Some of the footage dated back more than 10 years. Forensic teams identified at least 5 more women in those recordings. Some had never even been reported missing, suggesting that Callum may have targeted drifters, women without close ties, chosen carefully so that their absence wouldn't spark immediate investigation. The horror deepened as more locations were searched. Storage units rented under false names revealed even more evidence: clothes, handwritten eulogies, and photos Callum had printed and framed. One photograph showed Audrey's body days before it was discovered, placed in a forest clearing like a sculpture. It had been moved later, suggesting that even in death, Callum was trying to find the perfect position for his subject. Back at the station, Dr. Maria Lorne reviewed the footage and personal notes recovered from the house. She came to a chilling conclusion. Callum wasn't just reenacting a traumatic memory, he was perfecting it. Each kill had grown more elaborate, more composed. He wasn't reliving a moment, he was chasing an ideal, a twisted belief that death could preserve purity, that silence could be eternal if carefully crafted. The media exploded with the revelations. Greybridge, once seen as a quiet, forgotten town, was now the epicenter of one of the most disturbing serial cases in recent history. Families from across the state came forward, hoping to match missing daughters or sisters to the unnamed women in Callum's tapes. Some found answers, others never did. Callum Brecht was ruled mentally unfit to stand trial and was committed indefinitely to a high-security psychiatric institution. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was only to ask about the weather or the state of his garden. He never confessed, never explained, never expressed guilt. Detective Rowan Tace submitted his final report 6 weeks later, but he remained haunted by one detail. During the final sweep of Callum's property, officers discovered a list. It was short, only 3 names. 2 were already identified victims. The third name was new: E. Merrick. Eloise Merrick, Audrey Griffin's best friend. When questioned, Eloise revealed something she had never told police. A few weeks before Audrey's death, she had found a small bouquet of violets on her car windshield. Tied to it was a white ribbon, and beneath it, a handwritten note with no message, just a date. She had dismissed it as a strange gesture, possibly from a neighbor, but now she understood. That bouquet had been a warning, or perhaps an invitation. Though Callum Brecht now sat behind walls of reinforced concrete, the shadow of what he had done continued to spread. The murders were over, but the echo of his mind, calculated, cold and quietly watching, still lingered in the corners of Greybridge, in the memory cards, in the lace, in the silence.